Kanchikiwa. Hello, how are you all? Welcome to Homelands, originally broadcast on 90.5 FM CFCR, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory. I am your host, Andrea Ledding, Andrea Dishni Kashun. My name is Andrea, and call me Auntie Andy if you like. I'll be your host over this next hour. And I like to start by saying that I'm mostly Irish, a little bit Scandinavian, and then I'm kind of tied into the fringes of the sash with family from Batoche. They weren't part of the fighting, but they were part of the aftermath. And interestingly enough, the auntie that was part of that was 8 years old when it happened, and she remembers the soldiers riding through their farmyard. And then, she lived to be over 100. So I was born in 71. That was 1885. So she was still alive in my lifetime. So it's kind of in my memory. I was nearly 7 or 8 when she passed. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, that's always on my mind in the spring and kind of with Canada Day and everything else. So yeah, I just thought I would mention that. And so today we are joined by it's July, and we've just kind of gotten past Canada Day, and it's Jessica Iron has joined us again, and she came on a podcast last year, I think, and talked about conflict resolution as a yogi, as a principal and teacher, and she's from Canoe Lake, and she brings all of that. And also now she's she was a PhD student then, but she still is working on her dissertation now. And then she also has launched her podcast, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that. And I thought also just to throw in an extra theme, we could talk about, BIPOC healing, because July is BIPOC Mental Health Month. And BIPOC is, of course, Black, Indigenous people of color, people that have been through a lot more collective trauma than the privileged, and I have my own backpack of privilege, having fair skin, but being related and having Black people in my family, Indigenous people in my family. I know that I have it a little bit easier in terms of kind of the privilege that lends you to have fair skin. So, it's an interesting conversation, and that we have the Black History Month, and then the Indigenous People Month, History Month, as well as Indigenous Peoples Day, and sometimes a lot of the burden falls on the marginalized and the minorities to kind of explain things or story tell or rehash trauma and all that kind of thing, to explain things like residential schools and broken treaties and kind of all these kind of things, and land that was never surrendered, and collective trauma of colonialism. So yeah, I thought we would kind of dive into something nice and light for July. But Jess, you can jump in now and kind of start wherever you want to start, from your bio and from oh, and I forgot to mention a mother of three beautiful sons as well. So yeah, yeah. Welcome, Jess.
Oh, thank you, Andrea. It is always lovely to join you on your show. Yeah, the last time I came on, it would have been in the summertime. I don't think I had moved yet, so it would have been probably in July, because I remember I was in Lloyd still, and then I moved in August. So yeah, it's perfect. It's been 1 year. And lots has changed and happened in 1 year. Of course, the dissertation, as you mentioned, is still the same. Okay, there's been some progress, but I still have some work to do with that. And then, of course, I did start my podcast, and so in the fall it'll be 1 year. But in all honesty, I haven't done an episode in a few months. I've been very, very busy. But I plan to do some episodes, and hopefully I'll be featuring yourself, Andrea. We did a little bit of negotiating before we started today, and I think we'll have Andrea on as a guest on my podcast. It's called Philanthropy, and you can find it on YouTube, and you can find it on Spotify and Apple Music. And a lot of the episodes are focused on the healing that we do within ourselves, so that and that's like in whatever means, of course, if we look at the medicine wheel, mind, body, spirit, emotion, and doing all of that work so that we can serve the community in a better way. And so that's what the whole goal of philanthropy is, to help people on their healing journeys. And so I guess it makes a lot of sense that you wanted me to come on and talk about, this BIPOC Mental Health Month. And so I sure don't mind doing that. I think today, when I was thinking about, if we were to do a series of episodes, just kind of breaking it up, topic by topic in a way that would make sense. And I think today I wanted to kind of focus on healing and what does that really mean, and so I think for Indigenous people, and of course, I can only speak for myself because, I'm a Cree lady from up north. And my late dad was German though, but I was always status and connected to Canoe Lake Cree Nation. So, and I was raised in Cree communities. So that's pretty much how I identify, just because I didn't have a lot of German influence growing up. And I think for myself, I was thinking, okay, I can only speak from my own experience. And that's very Indigenous, that we can only really comment on our own experience. And I can't speak for anybody else's experience. But for me, I really wanted to kind of focus on the idea of healing, and healing, that it can mean returning to ourselves, returning to what Creator intended for us, and not so much that we're broken or we're toxic or all of these kind of narratives that we hear out there. That healing can just be a returning, and sometimes it's a returning that maybe we've never known or been introduced to, because if you think of Canada and you think of, that colonial legacy and how that's impacted Indigenous people, there's been a lot of policies, a lot of racist policies, a lot of, disruption to our Indigenous cultures and spirituality. And so some people have never known that connection. They've never known that spirituality, that sense of community. And so I think a lot of people are kind of working their way back towards, what does that mean? What does it mean to be an Indigenous person? And so that decolonizing lens, when we hear that word decolonizing, I think it often means unlearning. And it means unlearning the things that we have been forcibly taught. So, when we think of our Indigenous ways of being, knowing, doing, we didn't have access to that. And that was intentional, because the government really wanted us to assimilate into, their culture. And that meant we had to unlearn our own ways. And so now, what healing represents to me now is that we are returning to our Indigenous roots and understanding what that is. And maybe this is even the first time for some people that they're only connecting just now. And so they don't know and they don't remember, because they're being introduced to their culture and language and spirituality. And that's okay. But I think, in that process, it can be very messy and it can be quite ugly. And that's where we do see a lot of that lateral violence, because people are sometimes confused. Because they don't know who they are, they don't know their identity or their history or their culture or any of that. And so, they're walking through the world in a kind of confused state. And then that can lead you to doing all kinds of things that you wouldn't do if you were in a healthier state. That can lead to addictions, that can lead to all kinds of unhealthy relationships with a partner, with your family, with friends, coworkers. And so for me, I think that's what that really means, that healing is that reintroduction or re-entry to your identity and remembering. And it's not so much about the fixing that you're broken. I think when we look at it from a deficit lens, that we're, broken, then that can really lead us spiraling down a victim mindset. And when you become a victim, you no longer are powerful. You lose that sense of agency and that sense of power. And we definitely want people to, take their rightful place of power, to empower themselves. And when I say power, empowering, this is something that I often talk about, that power is not something that somebody gives you. And I think especially when we look at this colonized world, often people are fighting to be heard. They're fighting to be understood and to be recognized and to be respected. And to me, that's like you're asking for somebody to acknowledge you or to give you power, but you have to really find your power inside of yourself. And that can only come, I think, when you have a strong relationship with yourself. And it helps if you have a strong relationship with Creator. I'm not gonna preach to anybody and say that they need to follow any one way, because you may have listeners of different faiths, and I respect that. But I do think that, it's a natural source of power if you connect to Creator. And and when you do that, it becomes a lot easier to feel empowered. And if you're feeling empowered, then you don't need to ask for power. You don't need to demand to be listened to. You don't need to demand respect or anything like that, because you already feel that sense of power. Um, anyway, that those are some of my initial thoughts. I don't know what your thoughts are, Andrea.
That was an amazing introduction. Yeah, I love that. I love you know, being empowered by Creator and that relationship and also, and whatever that looks like, right? It can look like, I mean, Creator is big enough to come to anybody in any way they want, including them not believing in Creator at all, you know. But that connection is so big. And then that I loved how you kind of introduced it so gently that we are, remembering kind of who we were born to be, right? That you hold that little baby and there's just infinite possibility and so many gifts that we're born who we are, that beautiful nature. But then I heard it described another way, that we all know the bell of truth when we're born, that bell of truth that calls us back to who we are and that relationship with Creator. And then things happen along the way that kind of ding up our bell a little bit, right? And we, that whether that's trauma or relationships or things that you believe about yourself that aren't true. We kind of get to the end and our clappers may be crooked and but yeah, there's ways to kind of restore that. And I love that idea that, Creator kind of brings us back to ourselves, who Creator meant us to be, despite the trauma, despite the history, despite even, what's happening in the present day and all of that we can, be the best version of ourselves. I love that. So yeah, yeah. Keep going.
Well, and I do think that when we think about that healing, when we think about that remembering, that reconnection to who we are intended to be, that can look really different for people. That process doesn't mean, I'm going to give you the formula. You do this and you do this and you do this and ta-da, there it is. There's your identity. That process can look very different for people. And when we think, when I think of philanthropy and my podcast and that healing journey, um, maybe it never ends. Maybe it never ends from the moment we're born until the moment we pass. And it's constantly remembering, reconnecting, and getting stronger in that sense. And that can look so different in how you go about it, right? Like if we think about all the different means of healing. And I've talked about those a lot on my podcast, the different things that we can do for to promote the healing. Of course, there's things like meditation and journaling and song and dance and ceremony and prayer. And, there's so many different ways and outlets that can promote healing, healthy activities like exercise, healthy diets, lots of water and rest. And also, of course, losing those addictions. It's very easy. And I do find that addictions can be a big barrier to that healing process because what happens is you're stunting that process. If anything, you're maybe not even just delaying it, the inevitable, which is that healing process. You're also maybe adding injury to this process because a lot of times with addictions come the nasty behaviors. That's where we see infidelity and fighting, violence, murder, rape, all kinds of things, that are really awful. And maybe people wouldn't do so much if they were in a sober state, because then they might own that they have a lot of things to process. They have pain and things that they need to work through. So addiction to me, I think it's often a numbing agent, and it often just delays that process. So when people decide, you know what, I want to walk in my power and I want to, have a better connection to myself, to the world, and they lose those addictions and begin that healing process. And even that healing process can include, therapy. It can include so many different paths. Grounding. I talk often about grounding, that connection to nature. When you allow your feet to smush into the dirt, to smush into the earth, there's a natural electrical current that passes through, and it helps to reset us. And that's why when we're out in nature, we always feel so much better. Even if you're just walking outside in nature and you can feel the wind and breeze, and you're lost in the magnanimity of like the trees and the forest and all of creation around you. And you see the animals and you hear the birds and the animals, you feel the sunshine on your skin. It's very healing and therapeutic to us, and that really shows our connection to the world, to the greater experience of life. And so there's lots of different paths that healing can look like. And of course, if you're Indigenous, it really helps when you embrace your cultural heritage, when you embrace that culture and, you learn your language, you reconnect to your community. And, when you do all of those things, that can really be very healing for people. So, and of course, the BIPOC community is like, it's very large. It includes like all of the minorities, brown people. And so whatever, and all brown people around the world have been colonized, except for Asians. I always say, they're really fascinating because they haven't experienced it so much. They were, I think, maybe very fierce on their borders. Maybe we needed a Great Wall of Canada or something, because that Great Wall of China really kept out a lot of people, except maybe the Philippines. I know they were definitely colonized by the Spaniards, and so, but for the rest of us, a lot of that BIPOC community. You look at different nations. I've met people from India, and they were colonized by the Brits, and the path to that colonization was very similar to what we experienced. And same with Nigerian people, they were colonized by the Brits, and we've, commented on those experiences. Also, some of my Maori friends from New Zealand, they were colonized by the Brits. And so it's been all over the world, colonization has happened in so many places, but the process has looked very similar. And in fact, when you look at it and you study history a little bit more, then you start to see the parallels, and you start to see what was tried in one place and then carried on into another place because it worked. If you look at things like apartheid and segregation, well, that came as a result of our reserve system in Canada, and they were like, oh, look at this was a great way to contain the natives of the land. And so, they created this pass system, and so then they said, oh, let's try that over in South Africa. And you look at even sorry, I think I can't remember what I was like the residential school, that's where I was going. If you look at the residential school and the boarding schools, like those have been tried in lots of different places too. Australia, they had residential schools. In New Zealand, they had boarding schools. So lots of these tools of colonization and assimilation have happened around the world, and are not exclusively an indigenous experience, right? Or one that we have only experienced in Canada. And so, there's a lot of people who need to be, working through this healing process and understanding. And that's not to say that it's okay. Like, I definitely don't want anybody to feel that I'm okay with that, colonization happened and we just ignore it, and we just heal ourselves and ignore the pain and the anger and all of those things that come as a result, because it's really frustrating. I look at my own family and I think of, all kinds of toxic things that have happened in my family as a result of colonization, and how it's disrupted even my own family relationships, because our families were definitely very broken, as a result of residential school and all of these policies and the language being taken away, and our cultural practices, being banned. And so it's hard to move forward, and that's where I think a lot of people are really frustrated with, Canada Day, for instance, because you sit there and you think, well, why would I celebrate the history of this country when it has done so much harm to me as an Indigenous person? It's done so much harm to my family, to my community, and then it's like holding the government accountable for, the things that have happened. And I think that's why when we look at things like TRC and, even Indigenous Peoples Months, it's about making sure that people understand what has happened, and to know how it has harmed people, and how we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And, history will repeat itself if people don't know about, what's happened. And so while we're going through this remembering phase, it's also about reconciliation, and holding people accountable and saying, you know what, that can never happen again. That's not okay, and brown people will never become, another nation. They are who they are, and we need to respect that. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on any of that?
Oh, I think it's beautiful and it ties nicely into, I was kind of thinking, Canada Day. For me, it was really interesting because Carol Wolfe, who's my adopted sister, she's from Muskeg Lake. Her nephew is Chief Kelly Wolfe. She's deaf. And for her Canada Day, she loves it. And she's a proud Cree woman, but she loves Canada Day and she was in the hospital. So she said, "Oh, I love Canada Day. I'm so sad. I'm missing it." And I went, really, creator? So I went to Dollarama and I got everything like I bought
Mm.
out the Canada Day section and just like I
Aw.
made it look like Canada threw up in her hospital room kind of thing. Like
Aw,
she
that's
loved it,
nice.
we threw a big flag over her bed and we had tattoos on and yeah, it was just but then I went around, I went to Nigeria Canada Day actually. I'm adopted
Okay.
Nigerian as well. So
Yeah.
I had gone there last year and had a blast. So I went there again after I kind of did my running around and yeah, it was fun. They were saying, "Hey, Miss Canada, come take pictures with us." So I've never been called Miss Canada before, so it was very funny. But for me, it's not really like normally a day that I really celebrate in any kind of
Yeah.
yeah, I have like really mixed feelings about it, right? So yeah, it was a very strange Canada Day for me, but she really appreciated it and it cheered everybody up in the hospital too because they were all
Mm.
kind of like, oh, we're in the hospital and it's a holiday. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that was good. And I love the people and this land. It's
Yeah.
just the history that I have
Yeah.
issue with, right? So it's like that conflict. I have that inner conflict, right? Of kind of reconciling things with myself. So
Mm.
yeah, so that's really um yeah, kind of that mixed baggage and being part settler, but also like the Irish really experienced a lot of the same things. Like we were like the practice grounds for the British for like
Yep.
600 years or more. So they,
Yeah.
they did the boarding schools, they did the disenfranchisement. During the famine, the potato famine, the exports were the greatest they'd ever been, like beef, cattle, food, like they were starving us off kind of thing. So, I have that kind of genetic memory, I guess you would call it,
Hmm.
and so Irish people really relate very strongly with it. There's even actually a sculpture in Ireland from when was it the Choctaw or the Cherokee Trail of Tears actually, and they heard what was happening in Ireland and they sent money. They gathered it was like $162 or something. It was a fortune then, kind of thing. Just they
Hmm.
gathered that money because they had been marched on that Trail of Tears and famine, starved, and they heard what was happening in Ireland and wanted to help them. So there's a memorial on the coast. There's kind of this tie, and it's really kind of a cool thing. So yeah, I think, collectively we all remember trauma together and heal through it as best we can, by
Yeah.
and I like the word global majority, people of color as global majority, like
Mm.
really, when you count everybody up, that's the truth of it, right? I think it's the indigenous people that really are going to lead the way in terms of not only healing collectively and individually, but also our planet. So I think really that traditional knowledge is what we need, that relationship and that kind of thing. So we're kind of coming up to our break. So you've been listening to Jessica Iron on Homelands, and we will be right back on CFCR and of course YouTube. You can catch this episode on YouTube. Just Google Homelands and Jessica Iron, or if you want to catch the very first one, Homelands and Norm Flurry. It's a little tricky to find Homelands because there's like Homelander and Homeland Security and the Homelands, the TV series. So you have to Google it with a guest and then you'll find it. But you can also find us on Facetube, Facebook, Facebook and X. So yeah, we'll be right back after this break.